The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists gathered for the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old software developer from Chicago, clutching his camera and wearing the biggest grin anyone had seen that Tuesday morning. It was April 1st, and Marcus had what he thought was the perfect April Fool's prank planned. Marcus had been saving money for 3 years to take this trip to London. His grandmother, who had passed away the previous winter, had always dreamed of visiting England. She used to tell him stories about the royal family, about the brave guards who protected the palace, and about the tradition and honor that came with wearing that famous red uniform. Before she died, she made him promise to visit London and see the ceremony for her. But Marcus, being young and carefree, had something else entirely in mind. He had spent the previous evening at his hotel practicing his plan. He would pretend to be a mime, copying every movement of one of the Queen's guards. He had watched dozens of videos online of tourists trying to make the guards break character, and he was determined to be the one who finally succeeded. Marcus had even bought a fake red jacket from a costume shop and planned to march alongside the guard, matching his every step. The ceremony began with the familiar sound of military drums echoing through the palace grounds. Marcus positioned himself near the front of the crowd, his phone ready to record what he was sure would become a viral video. The guards marched in perfect formation, their faces stern and focused, their movements precise and disciplined. Each guard carried the weight of centuries of tradition on their shoulders, representing something far greater than themselves. As the guards took their positions, Marcus spotted his target. A tall guard with kind eyes stood perfectly still at his post, his rifle held at attention. The guard's name was James Mitchell, though Marcus didn't know this yet. James had been serving as a Queen's Guard for 4 years, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. For him, this wasn't just a job or a tourist attraction. It was his life's calling, his way of serving his country with honor and dignity. Marcus pulled on his fake red jacket and stepped forward from the crowd. Several tourists around him began to chuckle as they realized what he was planning. He started by standing next to James, copying his rigid posture and serious expression. The crowd grew larger as people pulled out their phones and cameras, eager to capture the moment when the guard would finally crack. For the first few minutes, James remained completely still, his training taking over. He had dealt with countless tourists trying similar stunts. Some would make faces, others would tell jokes, and many would try to touch him or his uniform. But something about Marcus's approach was different. The young American wasn't being disrespectful or crude. He was genuinely trying to mimic the guard's movements with surprising accuracy. Marcus began to march in place, his steps matching James's breathing rhythm. He held an imaginary rifle and kept his face as serious as possible. The crowd was growing, restless, expecting some kind of reaction from the guard. Some people started shouting encouragement to Marcus, while others began to feel uncomfortable with the situation. As minutes passed, something unexpected happened. Marcus began to feel the weight of what he was doing, standing perfectly still. For so long, maintaining that level of discipline and focus was much harder than he had imagined. His legs began to ache, his back started to hurt, and he found himself gaining a new respect for the commitment required to be a Queen's Guard. James, meanwhile, was fighting his own internal battle. Part of him was annoyed by yet another tourist, trying to make a mockery of his position. But he couldn't help noticing that this young man was actually trying to understand what it meant to stand guard. Marcus wasn't making jokes or trying to get cheap laughs. He was experiencing, even in a small way, what James did every single day. The April Fool's prank was supposed to last only a few minutes, but Marcus found himself unable to break character. Something about standing next to this guard, feeling the history and tradition surrounding them, made him want to honor the moment rather than mock it. He thought about his grandmother's stories and realized that this guard represented everything she had admired about English tradition and honor. The crowd began to disperse slightly as the initial excitement wore off. Some tourists moved on to other parts of the ceremony, but a core group remained, sensing that something special was happening between the American tourist and the British guard. Neither Marcus nor James moved or spoke, but there was a growing understanding between them that went beyond words. As the morning wore on, Marcus's fake red jacket became soaked with sweat. His feet were killing him, and every muscle in his body screamed for him to move. But something kept him there, standing, as still and proud as the real guard beside him. He was no longer doing this for the laughs or the viral video. He was doing it out of respect for something he was only beginning to understand. James noticed the change in Marcus's demeanor. The tourist's initial playful attitude had transformed into something more serious, more respectful. James found himself impressed by the young man's determination and endurance. Most tourists gave up after a few minutes, but this one was genuinely trying to experience what it meant to be a guard. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, and the changing of the yaktya guard ceremony continued around them. Neither Marcus nor James knew that their silent interaction was about to take a turn that would change both of their lives forever. The April Fool's prank that had started as a joke was becoming something much more meaningful, setting the stage for a friendship that would bridge two continents and two very different worlds. After standing motionless for nearly 45 minutes, Marcus felt his world begin to spin. The combination of the warm London sun, his nervousness, and the physical strain of maintaining perfect posture finally caught up with him. His knees buckled slightly, and he swayed on his feet. The crowd that had gathered to watch his April Fool's prank suddenly gasped as they realized something was wrong. James Mitchell noticed the change immediately. His years of training had taught him to be aware of everything happening around him, even while maintaining his rigid position. He saw Marcus's face go pale and watched as the young tourist struggled to stay upright. Without breaking his own stance, James made a quick decision that would go against every rule in his training manual. In the softest voice possible, barely a whisper, James spoke to Marcus. "Easy there, mate. Breathe slowly. Don't lock your knees." It was the first time in 4 years that James had spoken while on guard duty. The words were so quiet that only Marcus could hear them, but they were exactly what the struggling tourist needed to hear. Marcus was amazed to hear the guard speak. He had expected complete silence, maybe even to be ignored entirely. The kind words gave him the strength to straighten up and continue standing. He took James's advice, breathing slowly and adjusting his stance. The simple act of human connection, in that moment, meant more to Marcus than any successful prank could have. The crowd around them had no idea that this quiet exchange had taken place. To them, it looked like the American tourist had simply regained his composure and continued his mime act. But something fundamental had shifted between Marcus and James. What had started as a one-sided joke had become a mutual test of endurance and respect. As the morning progressed, more and more people began to take notice of the unusual scene. Palace guards who were off duty came to watch. Some of the senior officers began to gather, unsure of how to handle the situation. The tourist wasn't being disruptive or disrespectful, but he was technically interfering with an official ceremony. Yet something about the sincerity of his effort made them hesitate to intervene. Marcus's phone, which he had planned to use to record his prank, lay forgotten in his pocket. He had completely lost track of time and forgotten about his original intentions. All he could think about was not letting down the guard beside him. He began to understand that this wasn't just about standing still. It was about discipline, honor, and serving something greater than yourself. James found himself in an unusual position. He had dealt with thousands of tourists over the years, but none had ever shown this level of commitment to understanding his role. Most people saw the guards as living statues, tourist attractions to be photographed and teased. But Marcus was actually trying to experience what it meant to serve in this capacity. The guard began to remember why he had chosen this path in the first place. His grandfather had served in World War II, and his father had been a palace guard for 20 years. James had grown up hearing stories about duty, honor, and service to country. Standing next to Marcus, who was struggling to maintain the same level of discipline, reminded James of the deeper meaning behind his daily routine. After more than an hour, a palace official finally approached them. Captain Richard Hayes, a veteran, officer with 30 years of experience, walked slowly toward the pair. The crowd held its breath, expecting Marcus to be removed or even arrested. But Captain Hayes had been watching the situation develop, and he recognized something special in what he was seeing. Instead of immediately ordering Marcus to leave, Captain Hayes stood in front of both men and observed them carefully. He could see the exhaustion in Marcus's face, the sweat soaking through his fake uniform, and the determination in his eyes. He could also see something he rarely witnessed in his guards during routine ceremonies, a renewed sense of purpose in James's posture. Captain Hayes made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He nodded slightly to both men, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect, then stepped back to continue observing. His action sent a clear message to the other officers and guards. This was something worth watching and learning from. The crowd began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a tourist's prank anymore. It had become a demonstration of human connection across cultural boundaries. People started putting away their phones and simply watching in respectful silence. Marcus felt the change in atmosphere around them. The laughter and pointing had stopped. Instead, there was a sense of reverence that he had never experienced before. He realized that he was no longer just copying a guard's movements. He was participating in something sacred and meaningful. As the second hour approached, Marcus's body was screaming for relief. Every muscle ached, his feet were numb, and his vision occasionally blurred from the strain. But every time he considered giving up, he would glance at James and remember his grandmother's stories about courage and perseverance. She would have been proud to see him honoring the traditions she had so deeply respected. James was fighting his own battle. The emotional weight of having someone truly try to understand his role was overwhelming. He had spent years feeling like a curiosity, a living mannequin for tourists to gawk at. But Marcus's genuine effort to share in his experience was touching something deep inside him. The guard began to think about his own motivations for serving. Had he been going through the motions, or was he truly serving with the honor and dignity that the position required? Marcus's presence was forcing him to examine his own commitment in a way he hadn't done in years. As the crowd continued to watch in respectful silence, neither Marcus nor James realized that their interaction was being filmed by palace security cameras. The footage would later be reviewed by senior officials who would be amazed by what they saw. Two strangers from different worlds finding common ground through mutual respect and shared determination. The April Fool's prank that had started as a joke was becoming a powerful lesson about human dignity, respect, and the bridges that can be built when people take the time to truly see each other. But the most transformative moments were still to come. As the second hour of their silent standoff continued, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace had completely transformed. Word had spread through social media and news outlets about the American tourist who was standing guard alongside one of the Queen's men. But what the growing crowd and media didn't know was that something much deeper was happening between Marcus and James. Marcus was reaching his physical and emotional limits. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and his mind wandered to places he hadn't expected. He thought about his grandmother's final days in the hospital, how she had faced her illness with the same quiet dignity he was witnessing in James. She had never complained, never asked for sympathy, just faced each day with courage and grace. Standing there in his fake red jacket, Marcus began to understand what his grandmother had tried to tell him about honor and service. It wasn't about recognition or praise. It was about doing what was right simply because it was right. The guard beside him embodied this principle every single day, standing for hours in all kinds of weather, protecting something larger than himself. James, meanwhile, was experiencing his own revelation. In his 4 years of service, he had become somewhat disconnected from the emotional core of his duties. The daily routine, the curious tourists, and the repetitive nature of his job had made him forget why he had chosen this path. But Marcus's genuine attempt to understand and share his experience was rekindling something James had thought he had lost. The guard remembered his first day on duty, how proud his father had been, how meaningful it had felt to put on the uniform and take his place among the men and women who protected the crown. Marcus's struggle and determination were reminding him that his role mattered, that what he did every day had real meaning and value. Captain Hayes continued to observe from a distance, but he wasn't the only official taking notice. Word had reached the senior palace staff, and several high-ranking officers had come to assess the situation. They watched as Marcus swayed slightly but refused to give up, and they saw how James seemed more focused and present than he had been in months. The crowd had grown to several hundred people, but the mood remained respectful and quiet. Children pointed and whispered to their parents, trying to understand why the man in the fake uniform was standing so still. Adults found themselves moved by the display of determination and mutual respect they were witnessing. Among the crowd was Sarah Chen, a journalist from the BBC who had come to cover a different story but found herself captivated by the scene unfolding before her. She had covered countless ceremonial events at the palace, but she had never seen anything like this. She began taking notes, sensing that this was a story worth telling. As the third hour approached, Marcus felt himself entering a strange, almost meditative state. The physical pain was still there, but it had become background noise to a deeper understanding that was developing within him. He was no longer thinking about his prank or about impressing anyone. He was simply being present in the moment, sharing in an experience that connected him to something timeless and meaningful. James noticed the change in Marcus's demeanor. The tourist's breathing had steadied, his posture had improved, and there was a calmness about him that hadn't been there before. The guard realized that Marcus was no longer pretending to be a guard. He was, in his own way, actually serving alongside him. This realization hit James with unexpected force. Here was someone who had no obligation to stand there, no training, no uniform, and no pay, yet he was demonstrating the same commitment and dedication that James brought to his official duties. It was humbling and inspiring at the same time. The palace staff were facing a dilemma. Technically, Marcus was interfering with an official ceremony, and they had the authority to remove him. But the situation had evolved far beyond a simple tourist prank. The respect and dignity both men were showing had transformed the incident into something that seemed almost sacred. Captain Hayes made the decision to let the situation continue. He had served in the military for 3 decades, and he recognized genuine respect and honor when he saw it. Whatever was happening between the American tourist and his guard was something that should be allowed to run its natural course. As news of the event spread online, people around the world began to tune in to live streams of the scene. Comments poured in from viewers who were moved by what they were seeing. Many shared their own stories of service, sacrifice, and respect for tradition. The simple act of 2 men standing together had somehow touched a universal chord. Marcus's friends back in Chicago were watching the live streams in amazement. They had expected to see a funny video of their friend making a guard laugh or break character. Instead, they were witnessing something profound and meaningful that none of them fully understood, but all of them respected. The physical toll on Marcus was becoming more apparent. His face was flushed, his breathing was labored, and occasionally he would close his eyes for a few seconds to maintain his balance. But each time it seemed like he might collapse, he would find the strength to continue. The crowd began to silently root for him, willing him to persevere. James was struggling with his own emotions. He wanted to help Marcus, to somehow share the burden of what they were both enduring. But his training and duty required him to maintain his position and demeanor. All he could do was continue to stand as an example of the strength and dignity that Marcus was working so hard to emulate. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, both men understood that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. What had started as an April Fool's joke had become a test of character, a demonstration of respect, and a bridge between two very different worlds. Neither of them knew how this would end, but both were committed to seeing it through with honor and dignity. The transformation was complete. Marcus was no longer a tourist playing a prank, and James was no longer just going through the motions of his duty. They had become something more together than either had been alone, and their silent partnership was teaching everyone around them about the power of mutual respect and shared purpose. After 3 hours of standing together in perfect silence, the moment that would change everything finally arrived. Marcus, who had been fighting exhaustion and dehydration, suddenly felt his knees give way completely. This time, there was no recovering. His body, pushed beyond its limits, began to collapse toward the ground. In that split second, James Mitchell made a choice that went against every rule and regulation he had sworn to uphold. Without hesitation, he broke his rigid position and caught Marcus before he could hit the pavement. The crowd gasped as they watched the Queen's Guard abandon his post to help a stranger, his strong arm supporting the young American who had given everything he had to stand beside him. The moment was captured by dozens of cameras and phones, but more importantly, it was witnessed by Captain Hayes and the other palace officials. Instead of the anger and discipline everyone expected, there was a profound silence as they realized they had just seen something extraordinary. A guard had chosen compassion over protocol, humanity over regulation. James looked down at Marcus, whose eyes were struggling to focus. The tourist was mumbling something, and James had to lean close to hear him. "I'm sorry," Marcus whispered. "I didn't mean to let you down." The words hit James like a physical blow. Here was someone who had no obligation to be there, apologizing for not being able to continue an unofficial duty he had taken upon himself. "You didn't let anyone down, mate," James replied quietly, helping Marcus to a nearby chair that someone from the crowd had quickly provided. "You've done something remarkable today." As he spoke, James realized that he was no longer whispering to avoid breaking character. His official stance was broken, but something much more important had been built in its place. Captain Hayes approached them, and the crowd held its breath. This was the moment when consequences would be delivered, when the magic of the morning would be shattered by military discipline and royal protocol. But as the veteran officer looked at both men, he saw something that made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about duty and honor. Marcus was trying to stand up again, still determined to return to his position beside James. His fake red jacket was soaked with sweat. His face was pale, but his eyes still held the same determination that had kept him standing for 3 hours. "I can continue, sir," he said to Captain Hayes, not even knowing the man's rank or authority. Captain Hayes found himself smiling for the first time in months. "Son," he said to Marcus, "you've already done more than most people would ever dream of doing. You've shown more honor and respect for our traditions in one morning than some people show in a lifetime." He turned to James, and instead of the reprimand everyone expected, he nodded with approval. "And you, Mitchell, have shown exactly the kind of character we need in the Queen's Guard." The crowd erupted in applause, but it wasn't the excited cheering of people who had witnessed a spectacle. It was the respectful appreciation of people who had seen something genuine and meaningful. Children clapped with their parents, elderly couples wiped tears from their eyes, and tourists from around the world found themselves moved by a display of human dignity they hadn't expected to witness. Sarah Chen, the BBC journalist, was frantically taking notes and making phone calls. She knew she was witnessing a story that would resonate far beyond the palace gates. This wasn't just about a tourist and a guard. It was about respect, understanding, and the bridges that can be built when people see past their differences to recognize their shared humanity. As Marcus gradually recovered, sitting in the chair with James standing protectively nearby, palace medical staff arrived to check on him. They found him dehydrated but otherwise fine, though they strongly recommended that he rest and drink fluids. Marcus nodded but kept looking back at James's post, clearly still thinking about returning to his position. James was facing his own moment of reckoning. He had broken the most fundamental rule of his position by abandoning his post, even for just a few moments. But as he looked at Marcus and then at Captain Hayes, he realized that he had never felt more proud of his service than he did in that moment. The senior palace officials who had gathered to observe were having quiet discussions among themselves. What they had witnessed challenged many of their assumptions about duty, protocol, and the relationship between the royal family and the public they served. This incident would require careful consideration and discussion at the highest levels. As the immediate drama subsided, Marcus and James found themselves in an unusual position. The formal ceremony continued around them, but they had become the center of attention. Media requests were pouring in, social media was exploding with videos and comments, and palace staff were trying to manage a situation unlike anything they had encountered before. Marcus finally found his voice again and turned to James. "I came here today planning to play a joke," he said, his voice still weak but sincere. "I thought I was going to make fun of what you do. Instead, I've learned more about honor and service in one morning than I have in my entire life." James was quiet for a moment before responding. "I've been doing this job for 4 years," he said. "I thought I understood what it meant to serve. But watching you today, seeing someone choose to share in this experience when they didn't have to, reminded me why I put on this uniform in the first place." The conversation between them was being overheard by journalists and tourists, but neither man cared. They had shared something profound, and the opinions of strangers seemed less important than the connection they had forged through their mutual experience. Captain Hayes approached them again, this time with a more formal bearing. "Gentlemen," he said, "I need to inform you that this incident will need to be reviewed by senior command. Mitchell, your actions today were technically against regulations, but they were also an example of the highest values our service represents." He turned to Marcus. "And you, young man, have shown a level of respect and determination that has impressed everyone here today. Your actions have honored our traditions in a way that few visitors ever managed to achieve." As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that this was no longer just a story about an April Fool's prank gone wrong. It had become something much larger, something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The tourist who had come to make a joke had instead created a moment of profound human connection that bridged cultures, traditions, and expectations in ways no one could have anticipated. In the days following the incident, both Marcus and James found their lives completely transformed. The video of James catching Marcus as he collapsed had gone viral worldwide, accumulating millions of views and sparking conversations about duty, compassion, and human connection across every social media platform imaginable. Marcus had planned to spend only 3 days in London, but the media attention made it impossible for him to leave. News outlets from around the world wanted to interview the American tourist who had stood with the Queen's Guard for 3 hours. Hotels were offering him free stays, restaurants wanted to host him, and tourists were approaching him on the street for photographs. But the attention wasn't what Marcus had expected or wanted. He found himself uncomfortable with being called a hero or having his actions described as extraordinary. In his mind, he had simply been trying to understand and respect something he had initially planned to mock. The real hero, he insisted in every interview, was James Mitchell, who had shown true courage by choosing compassion over protocol. James, meanwhile, was dealing with his own complicated situation. The Palace Review Board had spent several days analyzing his actions and their implications. Breaking position to help a civilian was unprecedented in recent memory, and there were serious questions about whether such behavior could be tolerated, even if it was morally admirable. The review process was thorough and intense. James met with senior officers, palace officials, and even representatives from the royal household itself. Each meeting forced him to explain his decision and justify his actions. Throughout it all, James maintained that he had no regrets about what he had done, even if it cost him his position. "I took an oath to serve with honor," he told the review board. "Letting that young man fall when I could have prevented it would have violated that oath more than breaking my stance ever could." He had shown such respect for our traditions and had pushed himself to his absolute limit. How could I stand by and watch him collapse? The review board was divided. Some members felt that James's actions, while admirable on a human level, set a dangerous precedent that could undermine the discipline and protocol essential to the Queen's Guard. Others argued that his response demonstrated exactly the kind of character and judgment they wanted in their guards. Captain Hayes became an unexpected advocate for James during the review process. He testified that James's actions represented the highest values of service and that punishing him would send the wrong message about what the royal household stood for. "We don't want guards who are robots," Hayes argued. "We want men and women of character who can make good decisions under pressure." While the review continued, Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of returning to Chicago as planned, he asked for an extended leave from his job and decided to stay in London indefinitely. He wanted to understand more about the traditions and culture that had moved him so deeply during his time standing with James. Marcus began spending his days visiting museums, historical sites, and talking with veterans and active service members about their experiences. He read books about British military history, attended lectures about royal traditions, and slowly began to understand the deeper meaning behind the ceremony he had initially planned to mock. The transformation in Marcus was evident to everyone who met him. The playful, somewhat irresponsible young man who had come to London looking for a good April Fool's prank had been replaced by someone more thoughtful, more serious, and more aware of the weight that tradition and service carried in people's lives. James and Marcus began meeting regularly during James's off-duty hours. Their friendship, forged in those 3 hours of silent solidarity, deepened as they shared their backgrounds, their dreams, and their fears. James learned about Marcus's grandmother and her love for British traditions. Marcus learned about James's family history of military service and the pride he took in continuing that legacy. These conversations took place in quiet pubs, during walks through London parks, and sometimes just sitting on benches near the palace. Both men were still processing what had happened between them and what it meant for their futures. They had created something unique together, and neither wanted to lose the connection they had formed. The media continued to follow their story, but both men began to be more selective about interviews and appearances. They realized that their message was being lost in the spectacle, and they wanted to focus on the deeper lessons about respect, understanding, and human connection that had emerged from their experience. Sarah Chen from the BBC had been following their story closely and had conducted several in-depth interviews with both men. She was working on a longer documentary about their experience and its broader implications for how people from different cultures could connect and learn from each other. During one of her interviews with Marcus, she asked him what he had learned from his time standing with James. His answer surprised her with its depth and thoughtfulness. "I learned that respect isn't something you can fake or pretend," he said. "Real respect comes from understanding, and understanding requires effort. I went there planning to make a joke, but I ended up learning about courage, dedication, and what it means to serve something greater than yourself." James's interview revealed his own growth and reflection. "Marcus taught me that what we do matters more than I had realized," he said. "I had started to take my role for granted, to go through the motions without remembering why. His genuine effort to share in my experience reminded me that every day I put on this uniform, I'm representing something important and meaningful." The review board's decision was taking longer than anyone expected, and the delay was creating anxiety for both James and Marcus. James was on administrative duty while the review continued, which meant he couldn't perform his regular guard duties. Marcus felt responsible for the situation and worried that his actions might have cost James the career he loved. As the weeks passed, their story continued to resonate with people around the world. Letters poured in from military families, veterans, tourists, and ordinary people who had been moved by their display of mutual respect and human connection. Many shared their own stories of moments when they had been touched by unexpected kindness, or had learned to see beyond their preconceptions. The pile of letters and emails grew so large that both Marcus and James began to realize that their experience had touched something universal about human nature and the possibility of connection across differences. They had become symbols of something much larger than themselves, representatives of the idea that understanding and respect could bridge any divide. But the most important outcome of their story was still to come, and it would change not only their lives but also the way the royal household thought about tradition, service, and the relationship between the monarchy and the people they served. 3 months after that transformative April morning, Marcus Thompson and James Mitchell found themselves in a place neither could have imagined. They were sitting in an elegant reception room within Buckingham Palace, waiting for a meeting that would change both of their lives forever. The review board had finally reached their decision about James's actions, but instead of a simple disciplinary hearing, the matter had been elevated to the highest levels of the royal household. The story of the American tourist and the compassionate guard had reached members of the royal family themselves, who wanted to meet the two men whose actions had captured the world's attention. James was nervous as he adjusted his dress uniform. The weeks of uncertainty about his future had been difficult, but he had used the time to reflect on his values and his commitment to service. Whatever the outcome of this meeting, he knew he had acted with integrity and honor when it mattered most. Marcus, wearing his best suit and still somewhat amazed to find himself inside the palace as an invited guest rather than a tourist, was thinking about his grandmother. She would have been overwhelmed to know that her grandson was about to meet members of the royal family she had so deeply admired. He carried a small photo of her in his pocket, wanting her to be part of this incredible moment. When the doors opened and they were escorted into a larger reception hall, both men were surprised to see not just palace officials, but also Captain Hayes, several other guards, and a small group of people they didn't immediately recognize. The atmosphere was formal but warm, with an undercurrent of anticipation that suggested something significant was about to happen. The moment that defined everything came when a senior palace official announced that their actions had been reviewed, not just as a matter of military discipline, but as an example of the values that the royal family and the nation aspired to embody. James's decision to help Marcus had been seen not as a breach of protocol, but as an embodiment of the compassion and service that were at the heart of the royal household's mission. Instead of facing discipline, James was being commended for his actions. More than that, he was being promoted and given a new role that would allow him to work with the palace's public engagement programs, helping to build bridges between the royal household and the diverse communities it served. Marcus received an even more surprising offer. The palace officials had been impressed not just by his endurance and respect during the ceremony, but by the way he had used his experience to learn and grow. They offered him a position working with international relations and cultural exchange programs, helping to create opportunities for people from around the world to better understand British traditions and values. The offer meant that Marcus could stay in London permanently, pursuing work that connected directly to his transformative experience. It was a chance to honor his grandmother's memory while building a career based on the lessons he had learned from his 3 hours standing beside James. But the most moving moment came when they were told that their story had inspired a new program at the palace. The Ambassador of Understanding initiative would invite people from around the world to spend time with palace guards and staff, learning about royal traditions while sharing their own cultural backgrounds. It was designed to create the same kind of meaningful cultural exchange that had happened spontaneously between Marcus and James. As they signed the documents that would formalize their new roles, both men were struck by how much their lives had changed since that April morning. Marcus had come to London planning a silly prank that would last a few minutes and provide some laughs for his friends back home. Instead, he had discovered a calling that would shape the rest of his life. James had been going through the motions of his duties, feeling disconnected from the deeper meaning of his service. Marcus's genuine effort to understand and respect his role had rekindled his passion for serving and opened doors to opportunities he had never imagined possible. The ceremony concluding their meeting was small but deeply meaningful. Captain Hayes, who had become a mentor to both men, spoke about how their actions had reminded everyone present about the true purpose of service. "You showed us that duty isn't just about following rules," he said. "It's about recognizing our shared humanity and acting with compassion when it matters most." In the months that followed, Marcus and James worked together to develop the Ambassador of Understanding program. They traveled to schools, community centers, and cultural organizations, sharing their story and encouraging others to look beyond surface differences to find common ground. Their friendship, born in those 3 silent hours, became the foundation for a program that would touch thousands of lives. Marcus's transformation was complete. The young man who had once planned April Fool's pranks had become a bridge builder, someone who helped others discover the same respect and understanding he had found during his time at the palace. He often thought about his grandmother during his work, knowing that she would have been proud to see how her stories about honor and tradition had ultimately guided him to his true purpose. James found that his new role allowed him to serve in ways he had never imagined. Instead of standing silent and still, he was now actively engaging with people from around the world, sharing the history and meaning behind the traditions he protected while learning about their cultures in return. His act of compassion had opened a door to a career that combined his love of service with his natural ability to connect with others. 2 years after their first meeting, Marcus and James stood together once again in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. This time, they were watching as the latest group of Ambassador of Understanding participants took part in their own ceremony of cultural exchange. Among them was a young girl from Japan who had written to Marcus after seeing his story on the internet, and an elderly veteran from Australia who wanted to honor his own family's tradition of service. As they watched the ceremony unfold, Marcus pulled out the photo of his grandmother that he still carried with him. "I think she would have liked this," he said to James, showing him the faded picture. James smiled as he looked at the photo. "I think she would have been proud of you," he replied. "You honored her memory by learning to honor others, the April Fool's prank that had started as a joke had become something neither man could have imagined. It had taught them both about the power of respect, the importance of understanding, and the incredible things that could happen when people chose to see past their differences to recognize their shared humanity. Their story continued to inspire people around the world, proving that sometimes the most meaningful connections come from the most unexpected moments. Marcus and James had found friendship, purpose, and a way to make the world a little more understanding, all because a tourist decided to play a prank and a guard chose compassion over protocol. Years later, when people asked them about the secret to building bridges between cultures and communities, both men would give the same answer. It starts with respect, requires genuine effort, and succeeds when people choose to see the humanity in each other. Their 3 hours of silence had spoken louder than any words ever could, creating a legacy of understanding that would continue long after their story had become part of palace legend. The tourist who had come to make fun of a tradition had instead helped to strengthen and modernize it. The guard who had broken protocol to help a stranger had discovered that true service sometimes means knowing when to bend the rules. Together, they had proven that even the most unlikely encounters could lead to the most meaningful friendships and the most positive changes in the world.